Okay, I decided I was going to do a series of videos on kind of explaining some things for the new Facebook page group that I started for Christian ministry materials. So I would have a place where people could go and get links and information about the Christian ministry that we have here in our community in Central Texas. And it was really a time-saving thing to do that Facebook page because I wanted to keep a lot of that off of my regular Facebook page, and I'm constantly getting questions and things like that. And so I thought I would start this Facebook page where I could put up materials as they're made available. For example, I teach I'm doing a commentary on the book of Genesis, verse by verse through the book of Genesis right now in our Saturday night fellowship. And I wanted to be able to post those links, but I didn't want to post them on my regular Facebook page for reasons that will become evident. And so I started this little Facebook group, and then I saw a lot of people joining it who I know are likely to be troublemakers. And by that I mean they're friends and all that, but not particularly truth seekers as far as I'm concerned. But so I wanted to basically do a series of videos that kind of explain where I am and where I'm coming from and how I got to the opinion. And don't try not to get distracted by my hair. It's pretty bad. I need to get a haircut. But I wanted to do some videos, probably a series that's going to lead you through some of the things that I've learned that have kind of gotten me where I am. That way, if you at least you have an understanding of why I'm doing things the way that I'm doing them. And so, I thought I'd start this video and talk a little bit about why I quit the public ministry about 4 or 5 years ago, and pretty much restricted it to our own little community here in Central Texas. I used to traveled all over the world. I preached in 45 states. I traveled most of the year, preaching all over preaching to 300 or 400 people a night. Sometimes 2 or 3 sermons in a day. Sometimes sermons that were 8 or 9 hours long, and public speaking quite a bit. Preached on 3 continents, but I quit that. I started kind of pulling out in 2011 and doing more writing, and then 2012 I pretty much quit the public ministry. And so this video will be a little bit about why, and a lot of it has to do with the change in the positives and the negatives of the change in technology and how that has affected both the dissemination of truth and how people interact with it. And so, of course, for public, for public ministries, I'm gonna have to walk over there and get my coffee. For public ministries, the internet has been somewhat of a boon because you can theoretically reach a lot more people and talk to a lot more people without as much travel like we used to have to do, and it's easier to do research in some cases because you can, if you and for the people that do research sermons, most people don't, but people that actually do research, I've got a library of about 3,000 books, most of them theological, and most of them I'm pretty familiar with or I've read, and or read in at least, and back in the day, you had to, if you wanted to know some historical fact, you had to go look it up and you had to cross-reference it. I have about, I have about 16 different encyclopedias. You can see some of them right here that are, I'm going to tilt this down, that are all over the place. I mean, years, from the 20s, the 1910s, 1920s, sorry, all the way up into the 50s and 60s. And I use those and cross-referenced how truth changed through time in in the public mind. And so I have, and most of them aren't even out because when I moved into this office, we haven't finished putting all the bookshelves. So I have a room over here that is full of books, and I have a mini storage that's full of books. And the point is that you actually had to know something back then. You actually had to research it, and you had to know it, because when you were standing up in front of 300 or 400 people and you said, does anybody have any questions? And I've always finished every sermon or public speaking event by saying, does anybody have any questions? That there was a possibility that you would get a question from left field, something that way out there. And so in my mind, you need to be I need to be really prepared. And so even when you're engaged in disputation or debate, I wanted to be at least as knowledgeable, and hopefully more, about the opponent's position and reasons and foundations. And so what I'm going to do in this series of videos is talk a little bit about my own path of how I kind of got to where I am, and the opinions that I hold, because I wasn't raised with the doctrines and things that I hold now. And how I got there, search for truth, because a lot of people that contact me every day, or that have joined this Facebook group, have done so because they really are in a search for the truth, and they want to know the truth. And I'm wearing about 4 layers of clothing because it was cold this morning, and so now it's making me feel swollen. Anyway, and so I wanted to kind of walk through that, and in this video I'm talking about why I quit the public ministry. And the reason why is because although there are many advances, many of the advances in technology have been beneficial for the dispensing of information in a broader way. In the long run, it's actually been very harmful for anybody who's not a charlatan or a salesman, because when you actually are interested more in the content of what you're saying rather than how many people you can get it to, it changes everything. And what started happening right around probably around 2000 was, and this was before Facebook or anything like that, is a lot of the ministry elements started moving online. And how that started was you would have a website, which was and we still do, and it's kind of a clearinghouse of ministry information, statement of faith, answers to questions. Most of those were kind of thrown up there. There wasn't very much depth in there. A lot of them were very much the same. Mine, however, was quite controversial, because I actually took on head on a lot of the dogmas of the day that had no foundation in Scripture or in truth. They developed over time in areas and had kind of taken over. There had been a wholesale change in not just the gospel, but in what people thought about what the gospel was. And denominations had become majoring in particular pet theories rather than an overall view of truth and history and God and the existence of God and all of these things. And so these ministries moved on to online, and like I said, in some ways that was a benefit, but in some ways it was not, because it was the first step, and the first step in basically what would be the word, a diminution or a lessening of the necessity to actually know something, because since you weren't standing in front of a room of people with what you have in your head and your heart, but you were able to separate yourself from any immediate challenge or disputation as to what you believe. And so that was the first step with I saw with a lot of ministries, is that they became distant, unchallengeable. And if somebody did challenge a pastor or a preacher on a particular point, they had the ability to go and copy basically somebody else's argument. They didn't have to know the argument. They had the ability. They had to have the ability to look it up, which is still far better than what we have today. And that was the first step. That was around 2000, and then around 2003 or 4, ministries moved to having discussion forums, or some did, and the discussion forum became really a place for lively debate. And different viewpoints could be discussed. People could bring up challenges, but there was still some structure that stopped really, really stupid people, or really, really troublemaking people that are only looking, the trolls, is what term I'm looking for. There was a way to weed out people who were not really truth seekers, or who were not really acting with a civility, and you could kind of weed those people out. Pardon me. And so that lasted for a little while, and then that even became more difficult because those sites became targets for hackers, and you did have people who would get involved long term in ministry discussions and things like that. And then it turned out later on that they were either dishonest or had some other major issues. They took a part in what I was saying the pastors had, which is the ability to parrot somebody else's opinions rather than having to represent things that they actually knew and owned and believed. And so, and that was what was going on. And I was writing books. I wrote several nonfiction books and commentaries. I did a commentary on verse by verse through the whole book of John, the whole book of Galatians, the whole book of Acts, first 6 or 7 chapters of Revelation, Isaiah, and these were kind of mammoth undertakings of really Galatians. I think I don't know if I mentioned that. Writing books on these things, verse by verse commentaries, trying to educate people about the contextual meaning of Scripture. And what had happened for the last 100 years is that a lot of people had learned to use the Scriptures not as a book of letters and a history, but as individual sentences. Their minds got fragmented. And Francis Schaeffer talks a lot about the fragmentation of the mind, but the more the mind got fragmented, the Scripture no longer became a body of work that was non-contradictory, not internally contradictory, and considered in its whole as canon, but it became a book of quotes. And what you did is you went and found a quote that you thought supported your point of view, and that you threw that out there. And if somebody came up with another quote that they felt like countered that quote, then they would throw that quote out there. Then you had a quote battle. When historically in Christianity, the good-hearted attempt was to harmonize the Scriptures to show that they all do teach the same thing, and they're not in conflict with one another, and they're not contradictory. But that was lost over the last 100 years, and the Bible became just a book of quotes. And so if you were if you were against alcohol, then you had your quote that you pulled out. And if somebody said, oh, well, Jesus made water into wine, then you went found some gobbledygook professor who would tell you the Greek meaning of the word was not wine, it was grape juice or grape jelly or some nonsense. And that was easily defeatable by the connection and contextual view of the whole Scripture on the subject and the writing of the early church and all of these things. And so very late opinions that didn't even exist for the first 300, 600 years of the church, became ingrained in Christianity because people no longer had a book that they had to harmonize, that had to be true to them. The book didn't have to be true, only the parts that they wanted. And then from that, you developed a smorgasbord Christianity where people just picked out what they liked. And this spread into the churches and basically created an apostate, in my view, apostate church system, no longer taught the truths, historical truths of the Christian faith. And so that was bad, and that was, like I said, around 2003, 2005 that started really developing, and it had been developing for the last 100 years, but it became codified in the internet age because of the way that people consume information. And then the next step was when things like Facebook were developed, where you have the ability to instantaneously communicate, but at the same time, the people are sitting at a very high-powered computer that has mountains of information, most of it wrong, at their fingertips. So in the past, when you were confronted by, and I'm trying to be charitable here, but if you were confronted by an ignorant person, ignorance is not a pejorative. It just means you don't know something. And there are people who are ignorant and understand that, or they know that they're ignorant. And there are people who are ignorant and they don't know. They don't know what they don't know, so they're more prideful about their ignorance. And then you have people that are, according to the scripture, willfully ignorant. They choose to not know the truth. And so in the past, when I was traveling the country or the world, and I sat up in front of a group of 300 strangers and asked for questions, if somebody was ignorant, they only had the ability to draw from their ignorance. The pool of information they had to draw from was their own ignorance. And this was easily exposed. And so when they ran into somebody who was educated on the subject, or who had taken the time and the respect for the material to learn something about it, then it became obvious to the other 399 people in the room that that person was ignorant. And that's gone away because now this ignorant person has access to YouTube and memes and Wikipedia, or his particular doctrinal positions, dogma, and in seconds they can do a Google search and they can copy and paste nonsense. And for somebody whose job it is, or has the ability to refute that nonsense, it's too fast. It's too there's too much. And so no matter how many times you've run into the same stupid, dumb argument, to have to refute it every time. And then as you're refuting it, the person is, illogically dived from that into another area of error. And you can't pin them down. It's like trying to nail Jello to the wall. And this got worse and worse. Comment sections and Facebook and there was another reality that happened in real life, in the physical world, that mirrored what was going on in the internet world. And that is that, for example, I'm just going to use the Amish for an example. Christian communities have existed since the first century. Religious communities in general. And in the past, let's say the Amish, I'll use the Amish as an example. If there was an Amish community, let's say in Ohio, and some person, narcissistic, kind of sociopathic. And by sociopathic, I mean they have no roots. They travel around. They go from cult to cult or whatever, usually irresponsibly, and usually leaving a train wreck behind them. There's people like that, and there have always been people like that, and there were people like that in the first century that followed Paul around trying to cause trouble. And these people have always existed. And in the first century, not in the first century, but up until the internet age, if this Amish community, if some guy showed up and he said, "Hey, I want to be Amish," and they would have conversations. And one thing about sociopaths is they're very good at convincing people to receive them, to accept them. And you don't have like a dossier on somebody that tells you everything that they've done and the disasters they, the relationships they've ruined and all of these things in their past. And you don't know about the last group that they tried to destroy. And somebody shows up and they say, "Hey, I want to be Amish." And the Amish would talk to them, and at some point, because the people, sociopaths are good at lying, would receive them into the community. And for a time, that person would adopt Amish dress and Amish doctrines and go to Amish church and all of these things. But before long, sociopaths become weary of doing well, of well doing, and they're usually troublemakers, and something would happen, whether it's gossip or trying to overthrow the elders or trying to going house to house, as Paul talked about it, stirring up strife, or refusal to live according to the ordnung, the rules of the community, etc. And that person would just be kicked out. That was it. Or they would leave on their own. And this was common. It still is common. And that was fine. That was the way it should be. They didn't need to be there. And it's not some imposition on their freedom. They can go live wherever they want to live. If you choose to live in a society, you live according to the rules of the society. And so before the internet age, that's what happened. The person had no recourse to attack. They may write a letter to the editor and say, "Oh, make up lies. They beat their children. They whatever whatever aspersions could be used to cause people to have a poor feeling or idea about this group." But in the internet age, it's much worse because these people are naturally violent tempered and hostile. And in the internet age, what happened is, and this is about the time that our community was getting started, which was 2005, people would read my materials online, or they would read books, and they would say, "Hey, I really like this lifestyle. I want to live this way," or something like that. And then they would contact us, and they would say, "Hey, I don't have any money or whatever, but I would like to, live in this type of community. It sounds attractive to us." And we would try to talk them out of it, and we would tell them, why it was probably not a good idea. But as I mentioned, sociopaths are good at that type of behavior, faking things, and so, inevitably, at some point as Christians, I'll give you an example here in a minute, but you feel like you have to help people that say that they are in need of help, and so you talk to them and you let them know the rules and you let them know what the community is all about, how you operate, what the ordnung is. And now when things go bad, which they inevitably will, they just go online. They start a blog and they gather together like-minded liars and deceivers, and they just slander your character or whatever. Not that I care, but that's what they do now. And so this became very distracting to my family because I had to spend almost all of my time answering questions from people about nonsense that was being published somewhere that was so unbelievable that how anybody would believe it would be. We were eating horses or something, and they always go to some form of abuse or something like that. And so at the same time, I found that I really couldn't get anything done because rather than having the ability to face an accuser or face somebody who has an opposite opinion in a gentle and graceful way and refute their opinions intellectually, reasonably, from scripture, etc., you end up, like I said, trying to nail Jello to the wall, and there's not one of them. There's 1,000 of them. Ignorance has grown by leaps and bounds, and the arrogance that comes with a lack of knowledge that is supported by instantaneous access to erroneous information. So it used to be if you were dumb, you were just dumb. Now you're dumb and you have access to a computer that allows you to spew out opinions that you don't know, that you couldn't defend. And this is the meme generation, the propaganda generation. And it just became too much. And so I decided, because of that, to just withdraw from public ministry and just spend my time with the community and preaching in our little group, because I wasn't ever in it for fame, certainly wasn't in it for money. And it just was unrewarding as far as the ability to reach people in an effective way when you're having to shout over 1,000 ignorant voices. I'll give you an example. I said I'll give you an example. Today on my Facebook wall, I don't want to get into a doctrinal discussion on this video. That's not what I'm doing. I'm using a doctrinal position as an example of the point that I'm making. So I don't want this to turn into disputation on doctrine. But this morning on my Facebook wall, I saw where a guy I know through Facebook, basically. Seems like a nice enough guy. We share a lot of similar opinions on agrarianism and off-grid living, etc. But he had posted basically a meme. And he was attacking what the nickname, what he referred to as Calvinism. And his basic position was that Calvinism ignores these scriptures about free will. For those of you who don't know what Calvinism is, it's just a nickname. It's not a thing. It doesn't exist. It's a nickname that free will theists called Arminians came up with to categorize or name a certain category of beliefs. Calvinists, if you want to use that term, believe in predestination, and Arminians believe in free will. Those are the nicknames that are used. And of course, and this is a profoundly ignorant meme, profoundly ignorant. And it basically stated that Calvinists ignore these scriptures, and it had there are 5 or 6 pet scriptures or something that have been dealt with amply by the smartest minds in the history of the world for hundreds and hundreds of years. And it was just a profoundly ignorant meme. And I have this desire, of course, to get on there and dispute the stupidity of that assertion. And mainly my argument would be that there was an assumption, logical, he created a straw man to begin with. That's his first logical fallacy. And the second is what's called an appeal to authority, which is a declaration that because there's either a person or even in this case a scripture that makes a statement, that statement is automatically authoritative when it's taken out of its original context. And the most ridiculous thing about the statement was, first of all, Calvinism doesn't exist. It's a nickname. More accurate term would be monergism, or if you want to call it that. But is the assertion that somehow in the disputation between Arminians and Calvinists that have been happening for 400 or 500 years, that the smartest people and the biggest known ministers in the Christian faith in those 400 or 500 years didn't know those scriptures were there. They haven't already amply answered those and harmonized those into a solid position. It's just absurd, and it's stupid. And let me tell you why. Because I've been in this debate for 20 years. And let me tell you, 20 years was before widespread use of the internet, certainly before Facebook and memes. Let me tell you what I had to do when I wanted to learn. And I'll see if I can find it right here. Before I would ever debate anybody about free will theism or Arminianism and Calvinism and all of these things, is I wanted to know what they believed, and I wanted to know what they believed better than they did. Not only that, but I wanted to know how they were using those scriptures, whether those scriptures were being used contextually or whether they were separating them from their context in order to utilize them as a bludgeon for a particular dogma. And the reason I wanted to know that is because I want to know the truth, and because I came from a Christian background, Southern Baptists who are now Arminian. The Southern Baptist Convention was founded with a Calvinistic belief set, but I'm using the nickname now because that's what people use, even though it's inaccurate. And since I came from that background, I already knew the belief system, but I also wanted to know how they were using those arguments. So let me tell you what I did. Stay right here. I'll be right back. Try and find these here real quick. I'm in the library. That's what I did. It's probably written backwards when you're reading it. These are the works of Jacobus Arminius. And he was the one actually that created a system of belief that had a name, Arminius. It was actually his followers that created a system called Arminianism, which was the free will doctrines that this guy on this Facebook post is posting in a meme. And those arguments are, and these are out of order, are found in these books, which I read because I wanted to know his position. Jacobus Arminius was not a moron. He was not an idiot. He was in my mind, a Jesuit, which I prove in my book, Swarms of Locusts. And he had an agenda, but he wasn't stupid. And I would never insinuate that well-meaning or intelligent Arminians just didn't know the scriptures in Romans or Ephesians about predestination. Of course they know it. They have answers for them. Their answers are incorrect. I'd be glad to debate that at any time, but they have answers for them. And this guy's throwing this out there like somehow Calvinists haven't read those scriptures and don't have an answer for them. It's ridiculous. Let me tell you who the people were who argued those long before Calvin even lived. How about Augustine? Greatest preachers in the history of the Christian faith. Charles Spurgeon was a Calvinist. Jonathan Edwards, probably the most intelligent preacher in history. He did a little sermon you might have heard of called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. He also wrote a book called The Freedom of the Will. I've got it right over there, which I read in Australia in 2002, which is still used, a philosophical treatise on the will that's been used in philosophy courses and still is used today as probably the greatest book ever written on the existence and the nature of the will. Augustus Toplady. I'm going to sit here for a while just telling you very, very intelligent people who believed, who would be called Calvinists. Augustus Toplady was also wrote hymns like Isaac Watts, who wrote the book on logic that's still used in universities around the world today. Isaac Watts was a Calvinist. I'm using quotes here. I mentioned Charles Spurgeon. Pretty much John Gill, who all of these books right here are John Gill's commentaries, who was probably the greatest commenter. Manton, John Owen, 26 volumes of John Owen, was almost all of the Puritans, almost all of the Reformers, the original Puritans that came to America, the Pilgrims, like I said, some Isaac Newton. These are not stupid people, man. And it's ridiculous. It's a ridiculous assertion that somehow we just didn't, we didn't see your 5 pet verses that you use it. And you never answer ours, by the way. So that's my point. That's why I got out of public ministry. And because it's not worth it. It's not worth it to get on Facebook and start trying to shout somebody down or correct them because they don't have the ability to be corrected. and they have Wikipedia. It used to be when I sat across the room from an Arminian who was wrong, and he didn't know his scriptures, he didn't know his Bible, he hadn't memorized any of it, hadn't read Arminius, and he said something, I could refute it immediately. I could explain his scriptures in a way that harmonized with the rest of the Bible, and the rest, he may not be converted to the truth, but the rest of the people in the room would be, if they were reasonable and they were truth-seeking people. But now, that dummy sitting across the room from me, he's not there, he's in front of a computer, and he can go pull up a YouTube quote, or a YouTube video, or a meme, or some hackneyed, half-assed sermon that his pastor printed off from Dallas Theological Seminary, and he doesn't have to know it. He doesn't have to be able to defend it. And I could assure you that if this guy, and he's a nice enough guy, who posted this was sitting across from the room from me, he wouldn't be able to defend his position because he doesn't know it well enough. He doesn't know my position at all, but he doesn't even know his as well as he should. And I can assure you that that's true. I have no question whatsoever because I've been doing this a long time. And all of this is to say that men and women of goodwill who are seeking truth, it's a process that you go through, and that process is the willingness to die to yourself enough that you are willing to embrace truths that you don't already hold. In other words, to allow the evidence to speak, and fact and truth to speak, and not be overwhelmed by pride in such a way that your error is multiplied. And so I didn't want to make this video too long. This is video number one. The main reason that I quit the ministry was because the current state of the world, and through the internet and that kind of thing, is that I, with a family and with the constant attacks and all that, it just became better for me to, I haven't stopped writing, I haven't stopped preaching, I still teach every week, is to focus that in a smaller scope, and to separate myself from the means that ignorance was using to multiply itself. So this is going to be video number one. Starting in video number two, I'm going to kind of walk through my path, and maybe I'll have my hair cut by then. I got bad head right there. I'll walk through my path of how I came to understand the thing. Like I said, I wasn't raised the way with the things that I believe now. It was a process of truth-seeking and honest discovery and willingness to change opinions when I found one that better explained the evidence. And so I'll start that on video number two. In the meantime, if you have any questions for me, you can always email me, bunker2k@hotmail.com. Or, doesn't mean I'm not promising you an answer. I will try my best. You can always private message me on Facebook, and I'll try my best to try to at least direct you in the right way. Or if you want to just hang out, and I'll be posting links to materials as we go on the Facebook group. All right, so there you go. That's video number one. I'll probably entitle this something like Why I Quit the Public Ministry. Talk to you later.